Hello. Are you ready for the last part of the last chapter? We're going to finish the book today. Hashtag's out for another walk with Mr. Ben, so she's going to miss the end of the book. But at least you and I are here. So, in the first part of chapter 6, we heard Much Afraid's new name. So what is she going by now? Her name is Grace and Glory. And we saw the shepherd look totally different. He didn't look like a shepherd. He looked like a king. So here we go, the second part. So there's the king. And remember all the little stones that the king had taken out of her bag that turned into gems? He made them into a crown for her. The high places where Grace and Glory and her handmaidens had entered were not the highest of all. Others towered over them up into the sky, farther than their eyes could see. Those were the highest places where the king's servants went after their earthly life was over. What do you think that is? Is that heaven? There were many, many other mountain ranges in every direction also. Grace and Glory gasped in awe and wonder, realizing that there was so much more to see, so much more to learn. The king himself trained Grace and Glory and her friends to use their hinds feet. Instead of bounding ahead with his great strength, he carefully took only small leaps and jumps so that they could keep up with him. Grace and Glory hardly even wanted to stop to rest. Her whole life had been spent limping and struggling, and now she was leaping from rock to rock on hinds feet. Finally, one day she was so tired she dropped down laughing and breathless on a mossy rock. I guess even hinds feet need a rest now and then, she laughed. The king sat beside her. Grace and Glory, do you know how I was able to make your feet like hinds feet and set you up on these high places? She sat up and moved closer to him. How were you able to do this, my king? Think back over the journey you made, he answered. Tell me what lessons you learned on the way. Do you want to see the picture again? For a long time, Grace and Glory sat without speaking. She thought about the whole journey, which at times had seemed so hard, even impossible. She thought of the altars she had made along the way and of the little stones she picked up each time she laid down her own desires to follow his. She remembered the pool in the valley where he had called her to follow him to the mountains. She remembered her first meeting with sorrow and suffering and how she learned to let them help her. She thought of having to go down to the desert away from the mountains, then of walking by the sea of loneliness. Then there were Mount Injury and the forests of danger and tribulation and the days spent in the little hut during the great storm. She remembered walking through the mist and then finally arriving at the canyon of full surrender. At last she put her hand in his and said softly, My Lord, I will tell you what I learned. Tell me, he answered gently. First, she said, I learned that I must accept with joy every path that you lead me on and everything that you let happen to me. I am not to try to get away from what you want for me. I am to lay down my own desires and be your little handmaiden, acceptance with joy. He nodded without speaking, and she went on. Then I learned that I must forgive when others are allowed to hurt me. I am to say, here I am, your little handmaiden, bearing with love, or forgiveness. Then I will have the power to bring good out of the bad things that happen to me. He nodded again, and she smiled happily. So this is them talking. I'll let you see the picture. The third thing I learned was that you, my shepherd king, never looked at me as I was. weak and crooked and fearful. You saw me as I would be when you had done what you promised. You always treated me as though I were already the king's daughter and not poor little Much Afraid. She stopped and looked up into his face. "Oh, King, I want to treat others the way that you have treated me." He smiled at her with a very lovely smile and nodded for her to keep going. The fourth thing was really the first lesson I learned up here on the high places. Everything that happens in life, no matter how crooked and ugly it may seem to be, can be changed if I treat it with love, forgiveness, and obedience to your will. Here's the picture again before we turn the page. You let us meet with the bad and wrong things that you want changed. Maybe that is why we are in this world. You want the sorrow and suffering, the ugly and the wrong things to be made into something beautiful. You want us to overcome evil with good. At last, the shepherd spoke. You have learned well. Because of these lessons, I was able to change you from limping, crippled, Much Afraid, into grace and glory with Hinds' feet. Now you can run and leap on the mountains. And there's her friends. So remember this. As long as you are willing to be acceptance with joy and bearing with love, that's the one that means forgiveness, you can never again become crippled, and you will be able to go where I lead. Now use your Hinds' feet again. I am going to lead you to another part of the mountain. And off he went, leaping on the mountains and skipping on the hills, with grace and glory following close behind. Joy and peace went along, springing beside her, and together they sang another song from the king's great book. The king brought them to a beautiful flowery meadow filled with quiet gardens and fruit trees. They spent several happy days watching the king's gardeners working carefully with the plants and vines. So here's, you can see the picture again before I turn the page. One day, Grace and Glory and her friends went for a walk and found themselves on the very edge of the high places. Just so you know, there aren't really any pictures on this page, so that's why I'm not showing them to you. The great waterfall was thundering loudly beside them. From where they stood, they could see right down into the low places far below. There they saw a long green valley between two chains of mountains. There was a river winding through the valley like a ribbon of light. Here and there were patches of brown and red, which seemed to be houses and villages surrounded with trees and gardens. Suddenly, Grace and Glory knew what they were looking at. It was the valley where she had lived for so long. She sat down on the grassy slope and remembered her home. She thought of the little white cottage where she had lived and the pastures where the shepherds cared for their flocks of sheep. In that valley were her friends and fellow workers for the shepherd. She thought of her neighbor, Mrs. Valiant, and smiled. On the outside edge of the village was the cottage where her aunt, Dismal Foreboding, lived, and where she had grown up with her cousins, Gloomy and Spiteful, and their brother, Craven Fear. She saw the homes of her other fearing relatives, including the big old house of Lord Fearing himself. There was the house where pride lived, and near it were the homes of bitterness and resentment, and under those dark trees lived self-pity. She thought of those who had been her enemies on her journey to the high places, and of others who lived in the valley, people who hated the shepherd, people who refused to follow his ways. As Grace and Glory sat looking down into the valley, her eyes filled with tears, and her heart ached with pain. If the king can change Much Afraid into grace and glory, and if sorrow and suffering can become joy and peace, surely something can be done for my fearing relatives, she cried. And at that very moment, the king came and stood with them. Grace and Glory could hardly say her words quickly enough. "O King, my relatives down there in the valley, they're so empty and miserable. What can we do for them? They don't know anything about the high places and the kingdom of love. Will you find a way to rescue them as you rescued me?" The king looked at her kindly, and with great happiness he said, "I am very willing to do just that, Grace and Glory, but those unhappy people won't let me into their homes. They don't even want me to speak to them. I need someone to speak for me." "I see what you mean," she cried joyfully. "We, Joy and Peace and I, will go down and show them what you have done for us. We will tell them what you can do for them." "Do you think they will listen to you?" he asked, smiling gently. "No, I don't think they will. At least not at first," she answered. "I didn't act very nicely toward them before. But you will help me. You will teach me what to say." Then Grace and Glory looked over at the great waterfall, which joyfully sang the water song as the waters poured themselves forth. "Come, oh come, let us away, lower and lower every day. From the heights we leap and flow to the valleys far below, always answering to the call, to the lowest place of all." Suddenly she understood. She was only one of the many, many servants of the king who had been brought to the high places. She was only one drop among the millions of self-givers who could now pour out their lives like the waterfall. "He brought me here for this," she whispered to herself. The king nodded. Then he began leaping and springing down the mountainside before them, choosing leaps that they could easily follow. Behind him went Grace and Glory, with Joy and Peace beside her. The one who had been much afraid was returning to the valley to tell everyone who would listen about the shepherd king and what he had done for her. That's the end, guys. So, when the shepherd asked Grace and Glory what she had learned on the journey, she said 4 different things. And I want to go through them again. First, that she must accept with joy every path that he laid out for her. And second, that she needed to learn how to forgive. And third, that the shepherd never looks at us the way that we are right now. He looks at us how we will be. And the fourth was that everything that happens in life, no matter how crooked and ugly it could be, can be changed when Jesus gets a hold of it. So we finished the book. Thank you for hanging out with me. I love you.